and welcome to Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today is a British writer and filmmaker. After studying philosophy, sociology and politics at Cambridge, he worked in the film industry before becoming an author. After his debut, The Gone Away World, published in 2008, he produced 6 more novels and a work of non-fiction. He's the 4th son of David Cornwell, the great spy writer known by his pen name John le Carré. In 2021, after the death of his father, he took the writer's role in bringing the final unpublished le Carré novel Silverview to publication. The following year, he was called upon to do the final necessary work on A Private Spy, the collected edition of his father's letters, after his older brother Tim Cornwell, who was editing the work, sadly died. His latest novel, Karla's Choice, returns to le Carré's most enduring creations, the intelligence agency named The Circus and its spy, George Smiley. Set in 1963, the story sees a retired Smiley return to Cold War counterintelligence to find a missing Hungarian émigré and a potential KGB asset. Nick Harkaway, or should I call you Nick Cornwell, Nick le Carré, Aidan Truan? I just don't know who you are anymore.
I contain multitudes.
You certainly do, but as Nick Harkaway, you were born Nick Cornwell, of course,
yes,
from obviously this extraordinary family, and your father's backstory reads like a novel in itself. Spy, storyteller, serial family man. I wonder if you could tell us about that childhood.
The first thing I should tell you is that for years, I believed my childhood was exactly like everyone else's, except with a few variations. And in the last couple of years, I've begun to realise that is absolute nonsense. Just in the most basic possible ways. My dad was there in the house all the time. He was working, but he was present. And he was accessible to me. If I needed to see him, if I wanted to talk to him about something, he was there. Wasn't necessarily always welcome. You know, if you interrupt the flow, you get a bit person from Porlock. But you know, he was there. So that's just a huge thing in the 1970s. I was born in Truro. I grew up for the first bit of my life in this rattling series of little converted fisher cottages on the edge of a cliff on the south coast of Cornwall. And so when we moved to London, I couldn't sleep because I couldn't hear the wind howling around the edge of the house, and there wasn't enough rain. And you can watch from that house, you can see the weather that's going to hit the British Isles coming in across the sea like a curtain. I mean, if it's raining, you know, from miles out, you can see the line of the rain. And we had the eclipse there in whatever it was, the early 2000s, and we could see the Shadow Terminator line come in across the sea. You could, you know, I mean, it's a completely different relationship with space, I guess, than you have in most places in the UK. So that was the framing for it. And, I mean, it was idyllic. You know, my mum and dad worked together. My dad would start working early in the morning, read to my mother over the breakfast table, so I'd hear that. You know, I mean, and our lives were framed around the work. And I learned very early. We had big grey Bakelite, I guess, telephones with rotary dials and a row of numbers on the top. Because it was very flash, you could phone from room to room like an intercom. So they had buttons on the top to do that. And you could, later, when I was a bit older, you could transfer calls, which was miraculous. But if you answered the phone, you didn't give any confirming details to say that it was the Cornwall house or anything like that. You didn't even repeat the number. You just said, hello, how can I help you? And then you determined who it was. It was extremely kind of defence in depth, communication security, because in their lives and therefore in mine, you know, it was always the possibility that someone was on the phone, you know, who wanted to kind of get you to reveal some piece of information about the new book or doorstep dad or whatever. And that was a real thing, you know. He was at the height of his fame in the 70s and the 80s. Well, I mean, actually, it never got less, you know. But the frenzy around him was maximum. And you just, you know, you lived in a kind of conceptual defence all the time.
And I mean, having that work read around you, I mean, you must have basically learned to speak.
I know. I mean, this was one of the things that came up when I wrote Karla's Choice, which, you know, we'll get to. But yes, I was hearing 2 hours of George Smiley every day, basically, while I was acquiring the English language for the first time.
One of the details I've always loved from the books is the pictures with greyhounds or whippets, dogs at any rate. Tell us about the dogs.
Well, so the dogs, I think the dogs are really revealing, actually. I think people's dogs, this is a very unpopular theory, but I think people's dogs reveal a lot about them. My dad's dogs were always anarchic. He required them to come when called-ish, but to my mother's fury and delight, actually, because she also loved anarchy, they were mischievous beyond anything that you could live with, in a normal life. And they stole food, they climbed on things, they bounced around, and classically, he trained them to bark if they heard the word critic. So if you wanted them to go roaring out into the garden and chase rabbits or squirrels, whatever, you said, "Where's a critic? Where's a critic? Where's a critic?" And they would go nuts and they'd go roaring out into the garden. And, and of course, quite a lot of the time, people who came to visit were newspaper critics or literary critics or whatever. And I mean, it was very funny.
That is hilarious. Do you still have dogs?
We have now, my family has one lurcher. And we have the only lurcher in the world with no prey drive. She was just kind of post-lockdown dog. We had a grim lockdown time. Both of my parents died in 2020 and 21. My wife said at some point during the kind of long, grey struggle for survival, where we were just trying to keep my mum going down in Cornwall, at some point she said, "I just want a dog." And I was like, well, if that's going to help, we'll get one as soon as we can. Like if that's all we need. And so we got this dog, and we needed her to be gentle and empathetic and quite biddable. And that's exactly what she is. She's actually, we were walking her the other day, and she and another dog were sort of nosing around one another and just sort of generally frolicking a bit. And the owner was looking absolutely stunned. And I said, "Well, And she said, "Well, she doesn't play with other dogs. She's quite traumatised. She's a rescue. And, this is the first time I've seen her really kind of get on with another dog." I was like, oh, okay. That's the thing that our dog does. She won't play with dogs who aren't traumatised, almost. She's frit because, she's always being chased by other dogs and so on. But, so we've accidentally acquired a therapy dog for other dogs, who is incidentally existential herself. I mean, you look at this dog and she's just staring into the void all the time. And Dad needed his dogs to be anarchic. We needed ours to be uplifting. His had to be out of control. So they were, and interestingly, his sister's dogs, Charlotte Cornwall, the actress, her dogs were also always bonkers. And they were forever stealing the roast off the table and running around the garden with it. Not great for entertaining, but fantastic for slices of life.
Absolutely. I wonder if it took a huge amount of courage for you to declare yourself as a writer, living and being brought up by this sort of literary colossus.
Well, first of all, it sort of happened by accident. So I started out writing film script, which was something that he didn't do very often. He did occasionally get involved in film and TV, but it was always slightly equivocal. And his film grammar was very strongly 1970s. So he did things that in a modern cinematic context you just can't get away with. And people were always sort of too polite to say so. But there were a lot of long dialogues with sort of ghostly friends and so on, which in a modern setting it's quite heightened. You've got to work quite hard to get to that place. And I mean, he was a writer of wonderful dialogue, so there was a lot of dialogue, which again in audiovisual stuff doesn't always go well. But so I started writing film script, and that didn't work for me. I wasn't in the end very good at it. I'm much better at it now, actually, that I don't do it. I drifted then into writing my first book. And I mean, it was sort of a bit awe-inspiring as a thing to take on, but it was so different. The Gone Away World was so different from anything he would write, so it just didn't feel like the same thing. And I also grew up, with the idea that writing a book was just something you could do. That was the most sort of profound professional difference in my life, was just that I knew how it worked and that it was doable, that it could function as a life.
Did you discuss craft with him? Did you discuss writing with him?
This is really aggravating. So not really. I mean, we did incidentally if it came up. I never got a kind of masterclass afternoon where he sat down and talked to me about writing. Philippe Sands, on the other hand, Philippe, who was his neighbour in London for years, and they were great buddies, Philippe nobbled him and sat down and said, all right, come on, give it to me. And he's got a list. He reeled it off for me, and I do almost everything on it anyway. But I want that list. And I keep meaning to get it off him. We've done some events recently, and but he's so interesting, I always forget to ask him for the list.
But it hasn't done you any harm, because you have had you are enjoying right now a successful genre-defying career on your own. I mean, I think we first met, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, where I was interviewing you at Hay Festival for a very successful book, and they've gone on and on. I mean, you sell extremely well, even when there's no connection between Harkaway and le Carré, is there?
There isn't, although actually, bizarrely, I realised there is. John le Carré and Nick Harkaway don't sound entirely disconnected either. There's a sort of echo there, which was unintentional, but, there you are.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about the work before we get up to Karla's Choice.
Well, so that first book, The Gone Away World, was a reaction against screenwriting. In screenwriting, you have 85 to 135 pages, if you're lucky, or for a movie, or, you have a discrete amount for a television show in which to tell your story. You're always conscious of budget. So if you announce that the rebel fleet destroys the Death Star, that's a lot of special effects. And when you're writing a book, you don't have any of those constraints at all. So the Death Star gets destroyed every third page in the Gone Away World. There's everything. Just wild locations and trucks and fights and crowd scenes and monstrous entities and huge extraordinary physical structures that you'd have to build as a model or model in a computer or whatever. I just threw everything at it, and I broke all the rules of script writing as I understood them, and wrote this kind of wild adventure about a bunch of guys in a truck who have to save the world from some kind of existential crisis. And, and it's got all these movie tropes in it. It's a kind of rolling trucker martial arts philosophy action story, whatever you want to call it. And really, I kind of never looked back from that. I just did mad things. So Angel Maker is about a guy who accidentally switches on a clockwork doomsday machine and then has to switch it off again.
Can I just ask about that book, though? Because it was a spy thriller, really.
Which one?
Angel Maker?
It had a spy in it. It had Edie Bannister, who's an octogenarian, or she might even be novagenarian, retired kind of Modesty Blaise figure. And that was I just had this notion in my head for years about a kind of heavily armed Miss Marple figure who, instead of kind of, I think we'll have another cup of tea and then we'll all go to the vicarage and sort it out, when she saw the bad guy, she'd just pull a gun out from under her blanket and go, right, tell me everything or that's it for you. And I thought she should have a disreputable backstory. She should have been a dancer in a nightclub in Marseille or something and, fallen in love with the commandant of the Foreign Legion. And then that gradually evolved. And as I did that, for her story, it got more respectable in the sense that I started to learn about the women of SOE and figures like kind of Noor Inayat Khan, and I was like, well, these are amazing real people. And it was that time when the women of Bletchley Park were starting to be heard. Having done years of silence, they were told you mustn't ever talk about this, and they didn't, unlike all the boys who were like, well, I can't tell you what I did, but I did some very interesting things in a place near Milton Keynes. Very interesting, puzzling things. Would you like to
I know
wear
that man. I know so many of those.
I mean, and it's not that they're not fascinating, right? And I mean, Bletchley Park is the oddest moment in British life, specifically the moment when at the end they take all the computing stuff and they junk it. Why? What could possibly have motivated them to destroy all the machinery? Mm-hmm. Anyway, incidentally, Bletchley Park, fascinating place to go. And the house itself is one of the ugliest examples of British architecture. It's beautiful and so ugly at the same time. The sort of mad things that people did where they go, we need a turret. So they go, I don't know, where should we put that? I tell you what, we'll put it across the third window on the right. That's fine. Like, what? No. No, hire an architect. Get some aesthetics into this conversation.
Tiger Man was the next book. I'm desperately trying to keep you on track here.
Keep me rolling. Yeah.
It's a sort of superhero origin story, would you describe it?
Yes. I mean, I was angry about the War on Terror and Diego Garcia, and I'd read a string of wonderful books which had a kind of gentle, resonant tone in the language, and I wanted to try and do something like that. I'd been reading Michael Chabon, I'd been reading David Mitchell, and I was just envious. I read Cloud Atlas, and I was so furious at how good it was that I started writing Tiger Man in the back pages of Cloud Atlas. And this is something of a theme, incidentally. I will come back to it, because I end up reading something and being kind of driven by it to write another book. And the copies of the backs of books I have enjoyed, the end pages, have the new novel in them. So Tiger Man, I was about to become a dad. I delivered the draft of Angel Maker, and I was waiting for editorial notes, and my editor was taking a while. And I got frantic and bored waiting and started writing another book. And it was about a man who sent to an island in the middle of nowhere, basically to serve out the rest of his time as an army sergeant, finds that the world around him is impossible to ignore, specifically because he forms a friendship with a local kid who wants him to see all the terrible things that are happening, and he's been ordered not to. So he creates, because the kid is into comics, he creates this alter ego of Tiger Man, this guy who's going to clean up the mean streets of the island. But of course, all the real crime is state-level crime. It's not really kind of thugs and alleyways. It's dirty deeds being done in the absence of international law. And it takes him into effectively exposing the war on terror. And it's a novel about fatherhood and fear and all the rest of it.
And your next book really looks at state surveillance, I suppose.
Yes, Nomon is about surveillance as a service, really. So the conceit is that you have a society where surveillance is ubiquitous and completely integrated into everything you do. So you put your clothes in the washing machine, your washing machine sends a sample to the lab, and the lab says, oh, you're going to have flu in a couple of days, so I'm cancelling all your meetings. So then your kind of PDA cancels your appointments and says you're going to be sick until now, but we'll get you some drugs for mitigation, and you'll be through it by Friday, and then probably rest for the weekend, start working on Monday, and so on. And everything is like that. So that the state knows everything, but everybody lives in a state of sort of cupped in the hand of a benign digital, I want to say autocracy, but it's kind of, it feels more liberal than that. There's also a kind of rolling plebiscite going on all the time. It's 3:00 in the afternoon, you get all the votes for the day in your inbox. You go, oh no, I don't like that, do like that, don't like that. And, voting is considered on kind of rolling referendums is considered to be a part of your sort of social obligation. So it's one of those things I created as a dystopia, and then almost immediately felt that the world had become much worse than the state you're supposed to dislike. But of course, something's rotten in the state of Denmark. And at the same time, the book is, because one of the things that they do is if there's a crime accusation, they bring you in and they just read your mind. And in the book, what happens is they bring someone in, and when they read her mind, they find the lives of 4 people whose lives she hasn't lived, which is impossible. So then there's a kind of, and you get those 4 lives as sections of the book. It's a phantasmagoria, that book, and it bends people's minds into curious directions. So
all of these are written as Harkaway, but then you change your name.
Oh, so I didn't change it. I finished Nomon, which took an incredibly long time to write because it was complicated, and writing it nearly drove me mad. And I got to that point, and then the Brexit vote happened. And I was not content. I did not feel that was a good decision, and I was very cross with a lot of statements of uncertain verifiability which had been made in the quest of achieving the result that we got. Lies, lies, and damned lies. And I was particularly cross because the upshot of that was that I got more energised and creative in a rage, which was one of the things that we'd been told would happen. So, well, become terribly creative. Well, yeah, but out of necessity, because I was made creative by fury. And in 27 days, 25, I wrote the first draft of a book which was ultimately called The Price You Pay, which is a basically morally disimproving crime story. You will be a worse person when you finish reading it, which is, Jack Price, who is a perfectly respectable white-collar drug dealer who's kind of digitised and disintermediated cocaine and tried to make it as crime-free as possible, so it's just a service, finds that the 7 most awful people in the world have been hired to kill him, and rejoices because now, having been very sensible and staid and relaxed and violence-free all his entire criminal career, he now gets to do all the terrible things that he's dreamed up but would never do because the context around him has changed, and it's just him taking terrible revenge on the 7 most awful people in the world.
Tell me, though, why writing under Aidan Truhan?
Yeah, so because the book was written sort of almost on the shirt cuffs of Nomon, I had suddenly 2 books coming out at the same time, and the publisher of Nomon was very keen I shouldn't have 2 Nick Harkaway books. So I took a name from Nomon. Diana Hunter is one of the central characters in Nomon, and anagrammatized it so that Aidan Truan is an anagram of Diana Hunter. And Diana Hunter in the book is a novelist of existential pulp. And that her book is called Mr. Murder Investigates. And for quite a long time, The Price You Pay was called Mr. Murder Investigates.
Before your father died, did you discuss the fact that you might continue his work?
No, and it would have been a very odd conversation. So, no, we didn't. He spent a lot of time planning for his mortality, a surprising amount of which sort of seems to have come to nothing, in the sense that they spent an enormous amount of time doing very complex planning, which then just, I don't know, wasn't there in the event. You know, sort of everything was ad hoc. It was odd. Anyway, I think they did a lot of planning and then decided they didn't like any of it and junked it, which is, fine. But no, so when we talked about his mortality, it was mostly about telling him that he'd been a wonderful person and a great dad to me and so on. And I didn't like those conversations. His health was actually remarkably good in the sense that he was living with cancer, which was being treated and it was working very well and so on. He eventually died of non-COVID pneumonia. But when we talked about his mortality, he'd come back from the doctor and the doctor would say, well, you've got cancer here, here and here. And, and he'd get into a gloom, despite the fact that they were also saying, actually, you're going to be fine. And we'd go for a walk and he would talk about whatever he wanted to talk about. And really, I found those conversations very hard. You don't want to talk about mortality, the prospect of your parents dying. So I would just be reassuring. And actually, I was so reassuring that I talked myself into what I promised him was that I would finish anything he left unwritten. And then when he died, there was Silverview, which wasn't unwritten. It was done, but unedited. Mm. And I hadn't read it. And I read it and we published that because it was wonderful, And I took the chair for the kind of the incremental changes that needed to be made to get that from manuscript publication. So in that sense, we talked about my continuing a piece of his work.
So Karla's Choice, how did that come about?
Well, so one of the few things in the mortality prep that did follow through was that there was a letter of wishes, and it said, live well, enjoy the universe, but also while you're doing that, please make sure that I'm the most famous writer in the history of the English language, which is firmly tongue-in-cheek. Like, I should say this, I have to say this because so much of what's written about him is so serious and so impressed by his writing credentials, which of course are extraordinary, but he was fun. He was so much fun, and he was so aware of the ridiculousness of celebrity and fame just bemused him. He just thought it was absurd. So I can see him sitting with a glass of whiskey writing his letter of wishes and howling with laughter at how much he's going to stuff us with the various requests and so on. So yeah, it says, I want make my name resound in perpetuity. So there's a limited number of ways you can do that. If you can get a book onto the national curriculum, which, would be great. And arguably there are very good reasons to put, say, The Spire Came from the Cold onto or Tinker Tailor onto the national curriculum. What you can guarantee is that generations of school children will hate you. Because they'll be forced to read your book slightly too early. But they will know who you are. If you can guarantee film, television, stage, radio adaptations going forward, you can never guarantee those things, but if you can get them, that'll work. That puts people back into the frame of mind of thinking about your work. And if you can provide new books. So I made a list of writers around the world, commercial, literary, in-between, experimental, extraordinary writers that I thought would be amazing to write into the Le Carré universe. And I had my list, and we had a family meeting, if you please, a board meeting of the company. And I was unscrolling my list, which I felt was impressively long. And my brother said, before we get to that, I think you should do it. And I had already decided not to. And I'd already said, I'm not going to because it's this impossible literary mountain to climb. It's the defining novel of the 20th century, the Cold War and so on. Not the defining, but a defining novel. It forms people's understanding of the Cold War. It changed the nature of espionage novels. It is a universe on a par with something like Star Wars in terms of the scale of expectation. It's my father's universe on a par with... I'm not doing it. And when Simon said to me, I think you should do it, all those reasons why I shouldn't became reasons why I should. Mm-hmm. And so I was suddenly on board with the idea, and indeed suddenly I was like, I want this.
And did you inherit any already written plot lines, or did this come completely just from your own imagination?
So this, Karla's choice, comes from me. Now, having said that, there are in it references to Cold War stories that he used to tell around the dinner table as stories of things that happened and that were funny or that were outrageous or whatever. But those stories are also told by other people. You know, they are stories of fact. And I mean, but I lived with narratives from the Cold War, and doing one of the weird things, doing the research that I've been doing for the next book, I find myself kind of ticking things off and going, oh, I didn't know that I knew about this, but I didn't know that aspect of it. Weird little kind of crossovers of bits of knowledge I didn't have and bits of knowledge I did. So I was bathed in it. So he did leave us with little nuggets of stuff that he was exploring in the Smiley universe, but they are incomplete and frustrating. And they're also, it's really interesting. When he wrote Legacy of Spies, towards the end of his life, he didn't go back and reread the original Smiley novels. So some of the architecture isn't the same. And the bits and bobs that he left us from around Legacy of Spies and from his sort of re-exploration of Smiley and the directions that they don't, for my personal understanding, they don't mesh entirely perfectly with the Smiley novels as they stand. So they're beautiful, but tonally and in terms of plot, they're off. And they're by no means are they awful, extraordinary, but they're also, I think, unless we can find a way to make them work properly, they are inherently awkward in the canon. And they're the kind of thing that estates publish. If you publish them ill-advisedly, people go, well, why did you do that? And they're right to ask. And the answer is for completeness, for honesty, for disclosure, for excitement, for the last touch of the hand. But I'm never sure whether it works, so we haven't done that. There's one in particular which could form the basis of a story, but doesn't easily do so. And so maybe somebody else will have to do that.
Another sort of aspect of his whole body of work, really, particularly about Smiley, is the fact that sometimes times and dates don't really mesh. And I thought it was a really, really interesting decision for you to not write a sequel to a book, but to slot it in before Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. Tell us about that.
Well, so there is this big gap between The Spy Who Came In From the Cold and Tinker Tailor. And Tinker Tailor itself, the dates of the action in Tinker Tailor moved by a couple of years within the franchise. Honourable Schoolboy redates everything that's happened by a year, I think.
Because, of course, he wasn't writing a franchise.
He wasn't writing a franchise. He was writing books in the now. Yeah. And he very carefully, most of the time, doesn't date things, and specifically doesn't refer directly to the tentpole events of the historical Cold War. So, there is no reference to the Kennedy assassination, the Bay of Pigs, and so on. They get referred to obliquely and so on. Suez is referred to. Some things get a touch, but very few. Mostly you have the Cold War as a kind of grey, paranoid cylinder of time, all of which is created by the historical events we all know, but those events are not present in the direct experience of the characters. So you're never going to take Smiley to Washington after the JFK assassination and sort of, that's not how it works. So putting a story into the sequence, the obvious gap is this 9-10 year period. And it's not just a time gap, it's also a gap in story, because in Spy Came From the Cold, Karla, the spy master, just isn't there. There's no reference to him at all. And when and when you then read Tinker Tailor, it's all about Karla. Karla's been Smiley's nemesis for years. So there's a moment of transition, there has to be. And the first reference to Smiley and Karla in opposition is actually dated in the storyline to 1955. So it's before Spy Came From the Cold, but no one's very excited about Karla then. Smiley goes to try and recruit him, and Karla isn't interested. Smiley makes a bit of a hash of it, and no one goes, oh, George, what have you done? Yeah, no, fine, whatever. Let him go back to Moscow. He's only going to be shot anyway. And then he isn't. So from the moment where he's not shot, He is on the rise in some way. And so in 1961, they still don't mention it. Also, so there's no conversation about Karla, 62, 61. And so you've got to imagine that he's going to come into his own as a real figure in their lives in the 60s. And that enmity has to build between Smiley and Karla. And Karla simultaneously has to be impressed by Smiley because, there's a later reference. Smiley is the only threat. So he has to be neutralised. Well, okay, so in that case, they have to impress one another now.
I think it's absolutely brilliant what you've done. I wonder how it changed or altered your relationship with your father in any way. I mean, obviously, he'd gone by then, but just being in his world.
I don't know what it did. You're absolutely right. I mean, it definitely has changed my writing, and that was the thing that I, not changed it in any radical way, but it's a learning experience. Every book you write teaches you something about writing. Writing this book specifically for me has deepened and strengthened my understanding of writing and my relationship with my dad and my understanding of our literary inheritance, or his literary transfer to me, and made it real. As I say, we never sat down and did a masterclass. One of the things I wanted was to learn from him directly by doing this. And to do this, and I believe, I think it's inevitable that in doing this, I've internalized and codified 10,000 things that he told me over the course of his life.
Yeah.
That were about writing or about his way of writing and storytelling and so on, and kind of grasped those. So, I've acquired an understanding of how he would write.
I think that's wonderful, and I think it's wonderful that there are going to be more. I wonder if there is a dynamic Le Carré for the modern age coming up, Le Carré on social media and so on.
He hated social media. It was just sort of... He had already withdrawn from a sort of stern exchanges of notes with literary figures by the time social media happened, and I think he just thought it was a shorter, louder, more chaotic version of having a spat with Graham Greene. He was like, no, I don't want any part of that. In which in many ways he was correct. I find social media increasingly difficult because on the one hand, I love it. I have wonderful conversations with fascinating people. I meet people I otherwise would have to sort of compose a 400 GSM greetings card, hello, I am Nick Harkaway, the novelist. You are so-and-so, also a novelist. Shall we take tea in the green room? And I just can't, But actually, what social media is the green room for everybody who doesn't go on Monocle Radio. I just met a nice poet in your green room.
Yes.
And we talked about why is there a Halo Ionic supertanker model in a case, and I've just spent the time before I came on kind of Googling Halo Ionic, and I got as far down the Google results as essays on Walter Benjamin. Anyway, so whatever the connection is there. Anyway, so he didn't like social media. We have real John le Carré social media accounts on Instagram and so on. And we put all the kind of news that we have. We're trying to build it out and make it more substantive. It's time consuming, and, sort of, you need to feel that people are actually getting something from it. We try to make it more than just here we are all the time. And it's building. I'm not sure to what extent it makes sense as a serious investment of our time. We'll see.
On the cover of the book, both your names appear.
Yes.
And I just wonder, though, if you will continue writing not only as Nick Harkaway with John le Carré, but as Nick Harkaway on your own.
I will, and I am. The schedule is such that the next book, the book I'm writing now, is The Taper Man, which is the next George Smiley. But after that, I have a year in which to write a me book, which I will have to carve out time from the publicity process. But so I'm writing Cal Sounder, the detective, and Cal. These are the last two Nick Harkaway novels have been set in the world of Cal Sounder, Titanium Noir and Sleeper Beach. Cal's world is totally unlike ours. In it, there is a drug called T7, which makes you young when you take it, makes you a teenager again, makes you beautiful. But it also makes you, well, if you're beautiful to begin with, I suppose. I think anybody younger than me is beautiful now. But it makes you young again, and it makes you 20% bigger. And it's very expensive. So you get physically larger each time you take it. But the consequence, of course, is that only billionaires can afford it, and billionaires become ultimately 300 years old and 13 feet tall. And it's a fairly chunky metaphor. All the good things in the world flow downhill towards the dent that their physical and economic presence makes in the fabric of society. And Cal is a detective investigating murders in a world in which these people exist and effectively which these people define. And I'm enjoying that. I mean, and it has become, since I started writing the Cal Sounder books in whatever it was, kind of 2020 or something, let's say that the question of billionaire power has become a bit more noticeable.
Absolutely. Nick Harkaway, thank you very much indeed. Karla's Choice is published by Penguin and it's out now. You've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to the production team of Steph Chungu and Mariella Bevan. And you can download this show and previous episodes from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.